The van sat in the ferry parking lot, silent under November rain. Inside lay a purse, a wallet, even tickets never torn. But Jay Cook and Tanya Vayner, young Canadians on a short trip to Seattle in 1987, were gone. Their campsite dreams, their plans, their voices, erased without warning. Detectives searched forests, traced highways, interviewed strangers, but every lead dissolved into silence. For 30 years, the case rotted in evidence boxes, reduced to a few photographs and one abandoned vehicle. What secret lingered in the fibers of a rope? What story hid in a microscopic trace of blood? And who could wait decades before leaving behind the smallest genetic clue? Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The ferry left the dock with a low mechanical groan, carrying a mix of commuters, students, and tourists across the dark channel. It was 9:30 p.m. on a damp November night, the kind when fog clung low and light seemed swallowed whole. Ethan Ward, 20, and Marissa LeClaire, 18, moved through the crowd quietly. They had driven from Saunish, leaving family behind for what was meant to be a short adventure into Seattle. A camera swung gently from Ethan's shoulder, its strap worn from use. At his side, Marissa carried a canvas shoulder bag, zipped neatly, holding small things that would later be logged in evidence: ferry tickets, a wallet, a folded road map, and a box of film. They chose a booth near the window. Other passengers recalled them laughing, Ethan flipping through a guidebook, Marissa sipping a hot chocolate bought from the cafeteria at 9:45 p.m. The ferry worker remembered her politeness, her soft thank you. There was nothing unusual in their movements, nothing to mark them for memory. And yet, decades later, every faint recollection would be picked apart in interrogation rooms. The ferry reached port near midnight. A parking attendant glimpsed their van pulling out, headlights briefly cutting across the wet asphalt. After that, no one could say for certain where they went. No receipts surfaced. No phone calls placed. The couple disappeared into a night already erasing footprints. By the following evening, their families grew concerned. Calls to Seattle relatives confirmed no arrival. Parents phoned local stations. At first, police suggested the young couple might have taken a detour, even eloped. But by the second day, when the van was located, the tone changed. It sat alone at the edge of a Bellingham parking lot. Rainwater streaked the windshield. The driver's door was unlocked. Deputies approached cautiously, documenting everything before disturbing the scene. Inside lay the canvas bag, Ethan's camera still inside, a roll of undeveloped film beside it. Marissa's purse was zipped, her wallet intact with cash and identification. Ferry ticket stubs were discovered crumpled near the seat. Ethan's wristwatch lay on the dashboard, ticking on as though nothing had shifted. Detectives lifted each item with gloves, sealed them in paper bags, logged them by time and officer number. The process was clinical, detached, but the effect chilling. Every object intact, but the owner's gone. One deputy noted a muddy partial shoe print outside the driver's side. It was photographed, cast in plaster, and labeled, but rain had blurred the edges, making size and tread uncertain. Back at home, phones rang without answer. Family members retraced imagined routes with their fingers over maps, circling highways and ferry crossings. Volunteers gathered, flashlights sweeping across forest trails near the last known locations. Police dogs picked up a weak scent from the van to the edge of a riverbank, but there it dissolved into nothing. Reports were filed, maps annotated, statements taken. None led further than the van itself. News spread across the border quickly. Canadian newspapers ran photographs of the couple, smiling in summer light, juxtaposed with the grim image of their abandoned vehicle under drizzle. The community whispered theories: accident, runaway, abduction. Some neighbors muttered about strangers on the ferry that week. Others insisted the region had become unsafe for travelers. Yet for investigators, only one thing was certain: the couple had vanished between one dock and the next. Detectives placed the van in an impound lot, covered by tarpaulin. They revisited the scene with forensic kits, dusting surfaces for prints. Only Ethan's and Marissa's matched. They reviewed ferry CCTV reels, grainy black and white strips showing shadows of passengers disembarking. A man with a cap appeared near them in one frame, but the image was too blurred to identify. He was catalogued as unidentified male 3. In the absence of bodies, evidence became symbols of absence. The camera that never took another picture. The map folded to the Seattle page. The ferry stubs already validated, proving they had boarded but never proving they had returned. All ordinary, all preserved in evidence bags. The families pressed for answers, but detectives offered none. Without crime scenes, without suspects, there was only an unlocked van and a paper trail ending in darkness. The van sat under rain, its windshield reflecting only silence. Volunteers gathered at dawn, their breath visible in the cold November air as they formed lines across the muddy fields. Search coordinators divided the terrain into grids. Deputies walked shoulder to shoulder with locals, boots sinking into wet ground, each step measured, eyes scanning for a shred of clothing, a scrap of fabric, anything that might belong to Ethan Ward or Marissa LeClaire. Helicopters circled above with floodlights sweeping the tree line, beams of white cutting through mist and bare branches. But the forest yielded nothing except the sound of crows and the steady hiss of rain. Back at the Bellingham Sheriff's Office, maps covered a long table. Pushpins marked every sighting, every phone call logged since the couple vanished. A payphone receipt from a station near Everett sparked brief hope. Could it be Marissa? The clerk recalled a young woman, but surveillance tape proved inconclusive, the figure blurred by glare. Another lead traced to a gas station attendant who thought he had seen Ethan buying coffee. Investigators compared timestamps, interviewed drivers, but none connected. Family members crossed the border daily, pleading for answers. Ethan's father walked the impound lot, staring at the van sealed under tarp. Reporters photographed him standing beside deputies, his expression unreadable. Inside the evidence locker, technicians cataloged every item from the vehicle. Gloves lifted the canvas bag, cameras clicked, numbers scribbled on tags. Ferry ticket stubs were sealed in plastic envelopes. Ethan's watch was logged by serial number. The camera, still holding a roll of undeveloped film, was sent to the lab. The prints showed only mundane snapshots of ferry seats, blurred lights, and Marissa smiling faintly at the lens. Nothing suggested what came after. Canine units were brought in again. Dogs led handlers along the bank of the Nooksack River, noses pressing against moss and stone. One dog sat abruptly at the edge of the current, whining, but the water ran too fast for divers to risk a search. The report simply read, "Scent terminates at river." The community followed every update. Posters went up on telephone poles and grocery store windows, portraits of the missing couple with dates and phone numbers. Calls flooded the sheriff's office. Some claimed sightings along Interstate 5. Others reported hearing screams in the woods. Detectives triaged the tips, marking most as unreliable. Still, every whisper was documented, each one forming another page in a swelling file. Deputy Carla Hayes logged a footprint plaster cast recovered from the lot near the van. It measured approximately size 11, tread resembling a work boot. The rain had smeared the edges, but analysts preserved what remained. Another officer dusted the vehicle for prints again, hoping a mist ridge might appear. Nothing new emerged. Every surface spoke only of Ethan and Marissa. By the fifth day, the mood inside the command center had shifted. Initial optimism drained into grim silence. Theories hardened. Abduction by unknown male, roadside assault, possible transport beyond county lines. A profiler from the FBI suggested the involvement of a predatory offender familiar with the corridor. Local papers seized on the phrase, printing "predator at large" in headlines. Parents began keeping children indoors. That night, a local fisherman contacted deputies. He claimed he had seen a blue van near the bridge outside Monroe on the morning after the disappearance. He remembered because the vehicle door was ajar, and a man stood nearby smoking a cigarette. The fisherman described him as broad-shouldered, wearing a baseball cap. Detectives drove to the bridge, flashlights scanning for discarded butts or traces of tread. They found one cigarette stub half buried in mud. It was logged, bagged, and placed in the evidence locker. DNA would one day be drawn from its filter, but in 1987 it was just another sealed envelope labeled unknown. The first week ended with unanswered questions stacking higher than evidence logs. Every theory pointed in different directions, none strong enough to hold. The case file grew thicker, filled with witness statements, dead ends, and damp photocopies of maps. Detectives worked past midnight, phones ringing endlessly, families waiting in silence. Inside the evidence room, the canvas bag, the watch, the undeveloped photographs, and the plaster footprints sat together in neat rows. Each item carefully numbered, each tag initialed. The case, already growing cold, seemed to radiate a quiet void. The footprint cast dried under fluorescent light, edges blurred forever by rain. Detectives shifted focus from the parking lot to the people who had last crossed paths with Ethan Ward and Marissa LeClaire. The first to be questioned was a former boyfriend of Marissa, summoned into a small interview room where fluorescent light buzzed faintly overhead. He admitted their relationship had ended badly, a mix of jealousy and arguments, but insisted he had been working at a hardware store that night. Payroll logs and security time cards confirmed his alibi. Still, his name lingered in the file for years, underlined in thick pen. Attention then moved toward Ethan's circle. A coworker was pulled in after whispers about debts and late wages reached investigators. Neighbors claimed he was unreliable, prone to temper. Detectives pressed him for hours, sliding photographs of the missing couple across the table. He denied involvement, eventually producing receipts showing he was in Vancouver the entire weekend. Another lead collapsed, leaving only thicker stacks of interview transcripts. Anonymous tips multiplied. One arrived by letter, scrawled on line paper, claiming the writer knew where the couple was buried. It included directions to a wooded stretch near Everett. Deputies combed the area with dogs and ground-penetrating radar. Nothing surfaced except beer cans and old tires. The letter was sealed in evidence, handwriting compared against local offenders. No match. Analysts noted uneven strokes suggesting left-handedness, but beyond that the page offered nothing. It became another artifact of desperation, filed and forgotten until reopened years later. Forensic teams examined the van again. Carpet fibers were vacuumed, small fragments lifted onto slides. A technician noted one dark hair caught between seat cushions. Microscopic analysis confirmed it did not belong to either Ethan or Marissa. Without DNA databases, it was logged as unknown hair, case 1987-112. The entry sat in binders, waiting for science to catch up. Detectives interviewed ferry staff, replaying the same questions. Did anyone notice someone following them? Did a man board alone and linger nearby? One attendant vaguely remembered a passenger wearing a cap who seemed to watch the couple, but his face blurred in memory. He was entered as another unidentified male, the sketch rendered, distributed. Calls came from across the state insisting the drawing looked like a neighbor, an ex-husband, a drifter. None panned out. The investigation turned outward. Hitchhiker abduction was considered, given the stretch of Interstate 5 notorious for transients. Reports of women vanishing along the corridor raised alarm. Detectives traced known sex offenders, cross-checking travel records, but alibis or lack of evidence excluded each one. The case began to resemble fog, shapes forming, dissolving, leaving nothing firm to hold. Ethan's family grew restless. His sister Claire told reporters she believed someone they knew was responsible, not a stranger. Marissa's father, by contrast, argued it had to be a drifter, someone who would leave no trace. The disagreement seeped into coverage, headlines amplifying theories instead of evidence. Detective Ray Delgado, young on the force at the time, began compiling his own secondary file. He taped the sketch to his garage wall, circled names, drew lines between rumors. It was unofficial, driven by obsession rather than mandate. But years later, his private board would outlast many official efforts. The anonymous letter remained a haunting reminder of manipulation. Analysts revisited it months later, comparing its phrasing against police reports. The writer seemed to know certain details only investigators had released to press. Was it a cruel prank or an insider? Without fingerprints, the page became a dead end, sealed in a clear sleeve, fading ink a testament to silence. In absence of progress, suspicion turned inward. Detectives began to wonder if one of their early witnesses had staged his alibi. They checked time cards again, re-interviewed clerks, found no discrepancies. Even so, rumors spread in the community. Accusations tore at families. The absence of resolution created its own violence, invisible but lasting. Through it all, the van sat impounded, its contents cataloged, the hair sample and footprint locked in drawers. Every week, detectives returned to the same question. How could two people vanish while leaving everything behind? No money taken, no sign of struggle, no forced entry. Only a partial shoe print, a stray hair, and a letter with no face. The anonymous letter rested in its sleeve, ink bleeding softly into paper fibers. The discovery came on the 6th day of the search. Two hunters walked a muddy track near Monroe, rifles slung on their shoulders, eyes scanning for deer. The drizzle was steady, soaking through coats, muffling the forest. One man noticed something pale against the ditch, at first thinking it was a discarded mannequin. Then, as they drew closer, he dropped his rifle and staggered back. The figure was a young woman, her arms bound with coarse rope, body stiff in the November cold. They left the ditch in shock, stumbling to the road where they flagged down a passing truck and demanded it call the sheriff. Deputies arrived within minutes, sirens piercing the gray quiet. The area was cordoned off with yellow tape, fluorescent markers pressed into the ground around the body. The hunters gave statements, hands trembling, before being escorted away. Rain pattered against evidence kits as the forensic team documented everything: position of limbs, direction of rope fibers, the depth of water pooling in the ditch. Flashbulbs popped in rapid succession, capturing her face, her clothing, her shoes half sunk in mud. The tags read Victim 1, female. Only later would the name Marissa LeClaire be formally attached. Her body was carefully lifted, wrapped, and sealed into a black bag. Before removal, soil samples were scraped beneath her, layered into tubes labeled with GPS coordinates. A single cigarette butt, sodden, was collected 5 feet away, bagged and logged. Fibers from the rope were clipped and placed into small envelopes. Insects crawling at the edge of her clothing were trapped for later analysis, each one offering a possible clock of death. Every move was methodical, each object becoming an artifact. 2 days later, another call reached the Snohomish County Sheriff. A local boy fishing under a bridge had seen something caught in brush. Deputies pulled the shape onto the bank. It was Ethan Ward. His face bore bruises, jaw fractured. Rope dug into his neck in deep grooves, the knot still intact. The body had been concealed by debris pressed beneath the bridge timbers. The coroner on scene confirmed the worst. A second black bag was zipped, tagged Victim 2, male. The news traveled quickly, faster than official channels could manage. Families were called before the press conference could be scheduled. Ethan's parents collapsed into silence in their kitchen. Marissa's father drove across the border to Washington, insisting on identification himself. Reporters crowded lawns, neighbors whispered over fences, the sense of safety evaporated. Headlines screamed, "Canadian couple found dead," in stark print. At the Monroe ditch site, detectives scoured for secondary clues. They mapped tire impressions along the road shoulder. Photographers shot hundreds of frames of faint tracks dissolving into mud. Soil was lifted, compared, stored. A torn plastic wrapper, unrelated, was tested anyway. No fingerprints. A length of cord hidden under leaves matched the rope used on Marissa's wrists. Each item was sealed and transported, the chain of custody signed in triplicate. Autopsies provided precision where guesses failed. Marissa had suffered sexual assault before death. Blunt force trauma on her head suggested an attack with a hard object. Cause of death: strangulation by rope ligature. Ethan had defensive wounds along his arms, skin beneath his fingernails containing microscopic fragments of epithelial tissue. At the time, no method could sequence DNA from such small samples. The clippings were stored in envelopes marked trace, unknown male. Forensic photographs of their injuries filled binders, labeled by date and case number. The families were not present at autopsies. They were informed in windowless rooms at the sheriff's office, the words clinical, final. Claire Ward, Ethan's sister, recalled later the way the detective avoided eye contact, reading from a typed sheet. For her, the journal Ethan had left behind would become the only tangible voice she could still hold. For Marissa's parents, the waiting ended, but it brought no peace. The community responded with vigils. Churches filled with candles and photographs of the couple. Residents whispered about strangers on the ferry, about truckers using back roads, about predators hiding in plain sight. Some claimed to have seen a man in a cap near Monroe that week. Composite sketches circulated again, tacked on telephone poles. Theories flourished, evidence faltered. In the evidence locker, the items accumulated: rope fibers, hair clumps, cigarette butt, soil tubes, insect samples, fingernail scrapings. Each box bore the weight of unanswered questions. Detectives pinned photographs of both bodies side by side on the board, red string looping between Monroe and Snohomish. The distance was mapped, the time window calculated, but no suspect name filled the space between. Detective Ray Delgado lingered at his desk late into the night, studying the rope. He compared knots against manuals, traced the symmetry of the hitches. Maritime, trucker, scout, none fit with certainty. He wrote simple double half hitch, unknown. The rope was bagged again, sealed with tape, stored. Objects spoke louder than witnesses, but their language was incomplete. For the families, funerals replaced searches. Coffins were lowered into earth while rain tapped on umbrellas. Photographs from better days were passed around. Voices cracked at pulpits. Candles were extinguished by wind. And still, police urged patience, promising that evidence would lead somewhere. The bridge where Ethan's body had been found remained taped off for weeks. Locals slowed their cars to look at the place where the river lapped. Children asked questions parents could not answer. Fear rooted itself quietly in ordinary lives and daily routines. Back at the morgue, technicians prepared permanent slides of the fibers, archiving each under glass. Labels were typed in steady capital letters. Case 87-112. Decades later, those same samples would reemerge in court, unchanged, silent, damning. The drawer closed on Ethan's body with a hollow metallic ring. Deputies returned to the farmhouse outside Snohomish on a gray morning, the kind where fog draped fields and even crows stayed low in silence. The property had been vacant for years, its windows boarded, its porch half collapsed, but rumors swirled that it had been used by drifters. Inside, the air was damp and metallic, the scent of oil and mildew hanging heavy. The basement door creaked open, revealing a narrow flight of wooden steps. Each board groaned under the weight of boots as detectives descended, their flashlights carving yellow arcs across concrete walls stained with rust. The basement floor was cluttered. A coil of rope lay in one corner, frayed and stiff. 2 cigarette butts rested on a shelf beside a crumpled beer can. Oil-stained gloves were tossed on the ground. Dust layered the space, but some areas were disturbed, faint tracks in the dirt, recent enough to suggest movement after the murders. A detective crouched, lifting a shard of blue fabric from the ground. It was bagged, sealed, and marked for fiber analysis. Forensic technicians photographed everything. Tripods were set up, angles mapped. Soil cores were taken from the basement floor, scraped into tubes labeled with GPS coordinates. Swabs were pressed against the gloves, later showing weak traces of amylase, suggesting saliva contact. The cigarette filters were clipped, preserved in vials, each a potential DNA source in a future not yet imagined. Ownership records showed the farmhouse had been abandoned for more than a decade. The family who once lived there had left the state. In their absence, the property had become a shelter for transients. Neighbors told deputies they often saw figures slipping through fields at night, flashlights flickering. One recalled a pickup truck parked near the house days after the murders, a man in a cap smoking at the gate. The description matched dozens of men. No name attached. The discovery of the basement electrified the investigation. Detectives gathered in the sheriff's office that evening, photographs spread across the table. The rope's fibers were compared to ligatures recovered from Ethan and Marissa. Analysts reported consistency in thickness and twist, but not enough for absolute match. Debate sparked. Was the farmhouse the crime scene or a temporary holding site? Some argued the disturbed dust proved the couple had been brought there. Others warned the evidence might simply be coincidence, the work of squatters unconnected to the murders. The meeting ended without agreement, the rope sealed again in its bag, still only suggestive. Reporters caught wind of the search and printed headlines naming the farmhouse the lair. Community gossip turned the basement into a chamber of horrors. Parents warned children to avoid the property. Teenagers dared each other to drive past at night, headlights briefly illuminating its broken windows. The house became both symbol and distraction. Inside the lab, analysis pressed forward. The cigarette butts were cataloged as Exhibit 87-5A and 87-5B. The rope was cut into segments, each fiber mounted on slides under microscopes. The oil-stained gloves were swabbed again, revealing faint chemical residue, possibly petroleum. Dust samples showed traces of animal hair, likely rodent. Nothing pointed directly to a suspect. Each item became another piece of a growing puzzle, but the picture remained blurred. Detective Ray Delgado visited the site alone after hours. He stood at the base of the stairs, flashlight beam catching the rope coil in its bag. He noted how the basement ceiling was low, beams overhead leaving marks where taller men might have brushed against them. On the wall, faint scratches ran vertical, like something dragged along plaster. Delgado photographed them, filed the prints, but colleagues later dismissed them as water damage. For him, the space felt heavy, as though silence itself remembered what had passed. Community fear deepened with every rumor. Church sermons spoke of evil walking close. Families installed locks on sheds and barns. The farmhouse became shorthand for unsolved terror, a place whispered about at vigils where candles flickered against wind. Yet officially, detectives could not claim it as the crime scene. The evidence was too thin. In late December, forensic reports confirmed the rope fibers from the basement matched the general category of those used in the murders: nylon twisted quarter-inch. But the manufacturing batch was too common, sold widely in hardware stores across the region. The find carried weight, but not proof. The cigarette butts logged and stored remained silent. DNA technology had not yet reached the threshold to unlock what lay inside. The investigation stalled. Detectives filed reports, prosecutors read summaries, families listened to words like possible, consistent, inconclusive. None offered justice. The farmhouse sat abandoned again, tape fluttering in wind, its basement once more in shadow. For the community, it became the imagined stage of the couple's final hours. For investigators, it became a reminder of the limits of their tools. The rope coil rested in its bag, fibers stiff with damp silence. Claire Ward found the journal in early December, weeks after Ethan's body was buried. She had been tasked with sorting through his belongings in the family's small Sonish house. His backpack sat under the bed, canvas faded, straps torn from years of use. Inside, beneath a bundle of socks and a folded ferry schedule, was a spiral-bound notebook. The first pages carried nothing more than mundane details, sketches of cars, lists of cassette tapes, small maps drawn in pencil. But halfway through, entries shifted into the record of his final trip. The handwriting was hurried but legible. Boarded the ferry at 9:30 p.m., weather rough. We sat by the window. Marissa bought hot chocolate. He noted the cost, even the brand. Then another line, darker in tone, met a man, too friendly, kept asking where we were going. Claire read it twice, her pulse quickening. Later pages contained small fragments, each unsettling. He leaned too close when we spoke, didn't say where he was headed, smile wrong. Marissa's name appeared repeatedly, often paired with the words nervous or uneasy. One sentence was circled in red ink, trust broken too late. Claire carried the notebook to the sheriff's office. Deputies received it with gloves, immediately bagging it in plastic. They photographed every page before forwarding it to the evidence lab. Analysts examined the cover, dusting for prints. Only Ethan's and Marissa's appeared. The paper edges were swabbed, revealing faint traces of skin cells. A single hair was lifted from between two pages, bagged, logged. In 1987, such details felt irrelevant. 30 years later, that hair would yield mitochondrial DNA. The journal altered the direction of the case. Detectives reconstructed the couple's movements by cross-referencing entries with ferry manifests and gas station receipts. On one page, Ethan described buying snacks at a terminal store around 10 p.m. A clerk later recalled the couple, remembering a tall man standing nearby, not speaking, only watching. On another page, Ethan noted a payphone near the dock. Phone records showed a call placed to Canada at 10:17 p.m., likely Marissa speaking briefly to her parents. The journal became both witness and guide. Forensic handwriting experts were called. They scrutinized Ethan's script, measuring slant pressure, stroke width. The analysis confirmed authenticity. Yet one question lingered: who had supplied the red pen? All of Ethan's earlier entries were in blue or black ink. Detectives searched his belongings. No red pen was ever recovered. Some suggested he borrowed it on the ferry, possibly from the man he described. Others dismissed it as coincidence. But for investigators like Detective Ray Delgado, the anomaly became an obsession. The journal was compared against the anonymous letter mailed earlier in the case. Experts noted superficial similarities in stroke weight, but the slant and spacing differed. Conclusion: two different writers. Still, both texts described knowledge of the couple's route, feeding speculation that the letter came from the same man Ethan had described. The press seized on the journal's contents. Headlines blared, final words, trust broken too late. Reporters quoted excerpts, fueling theories. Radio stations debated whether the man on the ferry was a stranger, a fellow passenger, or someone who had followed them from Canada. Public imagination filled the gaps investigators could not. For the families, the journal was unbearable and necessary. Claire read it nightly, memorizing every line, searching for hidden meaning. Her parents could not bring themselves to look. Marissa's father believed the circled phrase confirmed his daughter's fear. To him, it was proof she had recognized danger too late. Vigils began featuring the line, written on banners, candles burning beneath. The words became communal symbol, a message carried from victim to survivor. Detectives pursued the implications relentlessly. They re-interviewed ferry staff, asking who might have loaned a pen to a passenger. One attendant remembered a man in a baseball cap filling out a crossword in red ink. His name was never recorded. Passenger lists proved incomplete. That lead dissolved into silence. The journal traveled between courtrooms, press briefings, and evidence lockers. Each time it emerged from its plastic sleeve, gloves turned its pages, cameras clicked. Analysts noted folds where Ethan had turned corners sharply, smudges where rain had dampened ink. On the final page, his handwriting trailed into nothing, a half-finished sentence cut short. Forensic teams cataloged every anomaly. Fibers trapped in the spiral binding were removed and stored. Stains at the bottom edge were tested, protein positive but indistinct, likely food residue. Margins carried faint impressions of other writing, as if the notebook had been pressed against a different sheet. They enhanced the markings under oblique light, revealing fragments. "Wait for him, Ferry." The partial words offered no context, but enough to deepen suspicion. Years later, in lectures on cold cases, investigators would cite Ethan's journal as an example of how ordinary objects could outlive silence. It was at once trivial and monumental, a college student's notebook transformed into forensic cornerstone. It recorded fragments of joy, fear, and suspicion, each page now frozen under glass. The last entry stopped mid-sentence, ink bleeding slightly where the pen had hesitated. Detectives built their next phase around suspects. With 2 bodies recovered, a farmhouse combed, and Ethan's journal logged into evidence, the focus turned to names and faces. Files stacked high across desks in the Bellingham Sheriff's office, each folder marked POI, person of interest. Over the years, dozens would cycle in and out of suspicion, none arrested, all leaving behind transcripts and frustration. The first wave targeted those closest to the victims. Marissa's former boyfriend was questioned again, his alibi tested for cracks. Payroll records held, co-workers confirmed his presence in the hardware store on the night of the murders. He remained a ghost in the margins, circled in early notes, eventually crossed out. Ethan's co-worker, rumored to owe money, faced similar scrutiny. Detectives searched his apartment, photographed his boots, even compared his knots against the rope. Nothing matched. He too was cleared. Attention shifted to strangers along Interstate 5. Hitchhikers, parolees, and truck stop regulars were pulled into interrogation rooms. One man, a drifter with prior assault charges, was detained for 72 hours after boasting he had ridden ferries with kids like them. But his fingerprints did not appear on the van. His DNA samples, limited though tests were in 1987, failed to connect. He was released. The case file recorded him as POI 17, another dead lead. Sketches flooded the walls. Witnesses described men in caps, men with mustaches, tall figures, short figures. Composite images blurred into one another, features generic, forgettable. Families looked at them in despair. None resembled anyone they knew, yet each carried the possibility of being the last face their children saw. Forensic work continued despite lack of suspects. Rope knots were sent to maritime experts, compared against patterns used in trucking, boating, climbing. Analysts concluded they were simple half-hitches, common, impossible to narrow. Cigarette brands from the farmhouse were traced to regional sales, useless given their ubiquity. Still, every object was preserved, documented, cross-referenced. Detective Ray Delgado became consumed. At home, his garage wall filled with photographs. The rope coil, the journal excerpt, the plaster footprint, the farmhouse mattress. Lines of red string linked places, times, and theories. Delgado told colleagues he believed the killer was a long-haul trucker who prowled ferries and highways. Others rolled their eyes, dismissing it as obsession. Yet his private board would outlast assignments, surviving long into the 1990s when others had retired. Years passed. Suspects aged, moved, died. New detectives inherited the case, re-interviewed old witnesses, repeated old mistakes. One tip came from Oregon. A mechanic bragged in a bar about tying up a Canadian girl years earlier. Detectives drove down, questioned him, found inconsistencies, but DNA from cigarette butts cleared him. The file grew thicker. Another dead end. Families lived in the shadow of names that never resolved. Claire Ward kept Ethan's journal beside her bed, convinced the line about trust broken too late pointed to someone they had known, not a stranger. Marissa's father argued the opposite. Only a predator could have done this, someone who roamed unseen. Their grief fractured into theories, both unproven. The rope, the journal, the farmhouse dust, each returned in investigators' minds whenever a new suspect was introduced. But no forensic match ever surfaced. Technology lagged, DNA analysis still crude. Objects were sealed, waiting. By the late 1990s, suspicion had shifted outward toward serial predator theories. FBI profilers suggested a single offender operating up and down Interstate 5, possibly linked to other disappearances. Delgado pinned maps of missing women across the corridor, threads stretching across 3 states. The pattern looked convincing but offered no name. The killer remained faceless. In the community, frustration hardened into bitterness. Annual vigils thinned. Newspapers relegated the case to anniversary pieces. Yet detectives still pulled boxes from shelves, spreading photographs on desks under fluorescent light. Each time the same faces reappeared, the same suspects dismissed. The files carried the weight of decades, heavier with every failure. The suspect board in Delgado's garage remained, strings taut, photographs fading, the rope image pinned at the center. By the early 1990s, the case had shifted from tragedy into bureaucracy. What began as a desperate hunt for a killer dissolved into paperwork, budget requests, and excuses. The evidence boxes were stacked in climate-controlled rooms, their contents sealed in plastic. While detectives rotated off the case, the families kept calling. The answers did not change. Whispers began about mishandled evidence. A former technician admitted off record that one freezer storing biological samples had malfunctioned during a storm in 1992. Backup power had failed for several hours. Some envelopes had thawed and refrozen before anyone noticed. Chain of custody logs showed nothing irregular. Reports were written as if the samples had been stable. Yet the truth spread quietly through the department. Parts of the case had been compromised. A memo surfaced years later, stamped internal use only. It noted possible degradation of specimen integrity, November 1992. The document was filed away, never shared with prosecutors, never disclosed to families. It was easier to bury mistakes than to explain them. Detective Ray Delgado, still obsessed, confronted supervisors about the freezer incident. He was warned to keep focus on active leads and stop undermining confidence. His board at home grew darker. He added the memo, circled in red, next to photographs of the rope in the farmhouse basement. To him, the system had betrayed the victims as surely as the killer had. Meanwhile, evidence handling grew sloppier. A cigarette butt from the farmhouse, originally logged as Exhibit 87-5B, disappeared for 6 months. When it resurfaced, the storage label was different, handwriting not matching the original officer. Questions were raised. Answers were vague. The official story was misfiled during transfer. Forensic analysts rolled their eyes. The families never learned of the lapse. Prosecutors faced political pressure to close files. Grants were tied to clearance rates. Supervisors suggested shifting resources to winnable cases. The double homicide from 1987 remained open in name only. Delgado and a few others pushed back, but their protests were buried under layers of memos, audits, and polite denials. Families grew hostile. Claire Ward accused the sheriff's office of negligence in a televised interview. "You told us everything was preserved. You told us you were doing everything you could. Were those lies?" The department issued a statement. The investigation remains ongoing. Nothing more. Behind closed doors, deputies complained she was making noise, as if grief were an inconvenience. By the mid-1990s, trust had collapsed. Community members filed public records requests. Most were denied. A local journalist reported that the evidence boxes had been moved between 3 separate storage sites in less than a decade. Each transfer introduced opportunity for loss, contamination, or quiet destruction. None of it was admitted. Inside the department, some officers whispered that higher-ups preferred the case unsolved. A solved case required manpower, trials, public scrutiny. An unsolved one could fade, reduced to a file gathering dust. Delgado disagreed. He wrote letters to the state attorney general demanding intervention. No reply came. The journal Ethan left behind sat sealed in plastic, its ink fading. Analysts requested periodic re-examination, arguing new methods might reveal more. Supervisors denied the requests, citing budgetary constraints. The rope fibers lay dormant in their envelope. The hair sample sat in a drawer. Opportunities slipped away not because the evidence was useless, but because the system treated it as a burden. In 1997, an internal audit revealed more. A box containing the plaster cast of the footprint had been signed out by an officer who later retired. It was never returned. The footprint, the very first forensic anchor of the case, was gone. When confronted, administrators called it clerical error. Delgado called it sabotage. Families threatened lawsuits. Attorneys demanded disclosure of the audit. The sheriff's office responded with silence. In public, they repeated the phrase, "The investigation remains active." In private, files were closed, shelves locked, reports buried. The cover-up was not a single event but a pattern: mistakes hidden, evidence misplaced, responsibility evaded. Each year that passed made accountability less likely. The killer remained faceless. The system ensured he stayed that way. In the evidence locker, the memo about the freezer sat stamped and silent, its words never read in court. By the early 2000s, the investigation shifted again, not toward a single suspect, but toward a pattern stretching across states. Cold case units revisited old binders, comparing Ethan and Marissa's murders to dozens of unsolved crimes along the Interstate 5 corridor. The similarities unsettled even hardened detectives. Couples vanishing after ferry crossings. Women found bound with rope. Abandoned vehicles with belongings intact. The geography pointed not to one county, but to a corridor that ran the length of the coast. Task forces formed. Washington, Oregon, and California shared files, photographs, and lists of parolees. Analysts built databases of rope types, knot styles, and cigarette brands. Each time the rope from Ethan and Marissa's case was entered, it reappeared in clusters of other homicides, patterns suggestive, never definitive. Cigarette butts, too, showed up at crime scenes from Tacoma to Sacramento. Without DNA matches, they remained mute artifacts. The FBI profilers drafted reports describing an offender or offenders with deep familiarity with highways, ferries, and isolated pullouts. They emphasized the possibility of a mobile predator, a long-haul trucker, someone who could disappear across state lines in hours. Delgado's old theory seemed vindicated. He pored over maps, drawing circles around truck stops, pinning photographs of victims from different counties. He called it the network, a web of violence tied together not by names but by method. Families demanded answers. Press conferences spoke in cautious terms. Investigative linkage, potential correlations. Journalists translated those words into headlines about a serial predator. Communities grew restless, parents watching children more closely, hitchhiking vanishing from the culture. Yet still, no arrests came. Forensic science advanced slowly. By 2002, DNA databases had grown into CODIs, a national system capable of linking crime scene profiles to offenders. Ethan's case was uploaded. The semen samples from Marissa, the skin under Ethan's fingernails, the saliva traces from cigarette butts. The profile appeared on a glowing screen, lines of code spelling out a genetic fingerprint. The result came back in seconds. No match found. The frustration deepened. Detectives watched the screen flicker, the green bar marking completion, only to be met with absence. Each time the profile was rerun in later years, the outcome repeated. A full genetic identity existed in the system, but no one it belonged to was in CODIs. The killer had never been arrested for a felony requiring DNA collection. He was invisible inside the most advanced forensic network ever built. Conferences on cold cases used Ethan and Marissa as examples. Slides showed the rope, the journal, the van under rain. Experts described the importance of preserving evidence, of sharing across jurisdictions. What they rarely admitted publicly was the haunting suspicion that more than one offender might have shared methods, creating patterns that confused rather than clarified. Still, the network theory dominated. Delgado expanded his board, now spanning 2 walls of his garage. Red string connected maps of ferry routes to maps of truck stops. Photographs of other victims were pinned beside Ethan and Marissa. He argued that a system of predators might have exchanged techniques, learned from each other, copied. The case no longer seemed singular but systemic. The families struggled with the abstraction. For them, it was not about networks but about names. Claire Ward said it best. "You tell us it could be anyone, but who was it? Who held the rope? Who tied the knot? Who killed my brother and Marissa?" Detectives had no reply. The network theory never yielded a suspect. It revealed the scale of violence but not the hand behind it. The profile remained perfect and incomplete, a set of numbers with no face. On the lab monitor, the DNA profile glowed green, followed by 3 words: "No match found." The murders aged into memory, but memory never loosened its grip on those left behind. Claire Ward carried Ethan's journal wrapped in cloth, folded carefully as if it might disintegrate. She read the circled line again and again, "Trust broken too late," and spoke it aloud at vigils, her voice cracking each year but never failing to return. The journal became her anchor, both comfort and torment. Marissa's father aged quickly. Once tall and commanding, he walked slower now, stooped, his hands trembling whenever he held a microphone. At every anniversary he stood before photographs of his daughter, voice shaking as he repeated the story, how she boarded a ferry and never came home. He insisted justice would come, even when decades of silence suggested otherwise. Each word was recorded by local reporters, printed beneath headlines that grew smaller as years passed. The community gathered each November, candles flickering in parking lots, songs sung quietly in church halls. Flyers were reprinted with the same photographs, edges yellowing, tape peeling from telephone poles. Children who had grown up with the story brought their own children, pointing to the images of Ethan and Marissa as reminders of what had been lost. The case became less about fear and more about ritual, an act of collective memory against forgetting. Detectives attended some vigils, standing awkwardly at the edges, their uniforms both a promise and a reminder of failure. Delgado often stood alone, his coat damp with rain, eyes fixed not on the candles but on the families. He carried guilt like weight in his chest, convinced that evidence had been mishandled, that answers had been there all along. At home, his board remained intact, photographs curling with age, red string sagging but unbroken. Forensic anchors persisted in unexpected ways. At one vigil in 2005, a candle tipped and scorched the ground. The wax hardened, leaving pale circles near the posters of Ethan and Marissa. When vandals later threatened to tear down the memorial, deputies collected fragments of wax, storing them in a bag as if the vigil itself had become part of the case. Even grief turned forensic, sealed and logged. Survivors adapted in fractured ways. Claire became an advocate for cold case funding, speaking at universities about the importance of preserving evidence. She carried Ethan's watch to every lecture, displaying it under glass, ticking still though he had not worn it since 1987. Marissa's mother withdrew instead, declining interviews, refusing to leave home on anniversaries. Her absence was felt as sharply as her daughter's. The town changed. Streets were renamed, businesses closed, new families moved in who knew nothing of the vanished Canadians. Yet the old community kept the story alive. To them, every ferry carried an echo, every abandoned farmhouse another possible scene. The murders haunted not just families but the geography itself. Journalists returned less often, until the anniversaries drew only a few paragraphs in back pages. But in the sheriff's office the boxes remained, their labels fading but still legible. Inside were objects that had outlived the victims: rope fibers, cigarette filters, soil samples, and a half-finished sentence in a journal. For survivors, life was divided into before and after November 1987. Before was innocence, after was vigilance. Doors were locked earlier, travel felt dangerous, trust was rationed. Claire said once in an interview rarely quoted, "We never buried them properly. Their bodies were lowered, yes, but their story stayed above ground. We live inside it." Her words described the survivors more accurately than any report. The vigil candles burned low, wax dripping into cold November pavement. The break came in 2018, more than 30 years after Ethan Ward and Marissa LeClaire boarded the ferry. By then, technology had outrun the mistakes of the past. The samples long sealed in envelopes, the saliva trapped in filters, the skin cells buried beneath Ethan's nails, all had waited silently for a science capable of hearing them. Forensic genealogy changed the landscape. What began with private companies cataloging DNA for ancestry searches soon crossed into law enforcement. For the first time, investigators could take an unknown profile and place it inside sprawling family trees. Detectives pulled the DNA profile created from the semen sample preserved in 1987 and uploaded it into the genealogy network. Within days, a web of distant cousins appeared, second cousins, third cousins, relatives who had never heard of Ethan or Marissa but whose genetic code now held the key to their deaths. Analysts built sprawling family trees on whiteboards, tracing lines backward through generations, then forward into the present. After weeks of sorting branches, one name emerged: Walter Halden Roman II, a trucker living in Washington. Detectives moved cautiously. Surveillance teams followed him, waiting for a chance to collect what the law called abandoned DNA. One evening, he discarded a paper cup into a garbage bin outside his workplace. The cup was retrieved, sealed, and rushed to the lab. Hours later, results flashed on the screen, a perfect match. The DNA from the crime scenes, the saliva on cigarette butts, the trace beneath Ethan's fingernails, it was all his. After 3 decades of silence, the killer finally had a name. The arrest came at dawn. Deputies approached Halden's modest house, weapons drawn, voices echoing through the neighborhood as he was pulled into the street. Neighbors watched from windows, stunned. For years he had lived among them as a mechanic, attending barbecues, fixing engines, invisible in plain sight. Now he was cuffed, read his rights, and taken away. In the courtroom months later, the families filled the benches. Claire carried Ethan's journal in her hands. Marissa's father gripped her photograph. Prosecutors presented the evidence with clinical precision. Rope fibers, cigarette butts, semen samples, DNA charts, all projected on large screens. Analysts explained how saliva molecules, frozen for decades, had built the bridge to his identity. They displayed the family tree diagrams, branches stretching across generations until the line narrowed to one man. The defense tried to sow doubt. They argued the samples were contaminated, chain of custody compromised. They pointed to missing footprint casts, freezer malfunctions, misplaced envelopes. But the DNA match was absolute, billions to one certainty. Each forensic anchor, once cold, now converged with clarity. Witnesses took the stand. Claire read from Ethan's journal, her voice shaking as she repeated the circled line, "Trust broken too late." Prosecutors let the words hang in silence. Marissa's father described her smile, her plans, her fear of the stranger on the ferry. The court listened not just to science but to grief. Halden sat impassive, eyes fixed on the table. He offered no confession, no apology. When asked to address the court, he refused. His silence only deepened the weight of the room. The jury deliberated less than 2 days. The verdict, guilty on all counts, life without parole. Applause did not erupt, only quiet sobs, gasps, hands clasped in relief and exhaustion. 30 years of waiting had ended, not in triumph but in weary release. Yet even in victory, shadows lingered. Questions about the investigation's failures resurfaced. Why had evidence been misplaced? Why had families been misled for decades? Why had technology been required to succeed where procedure had failed? Reporters pressed these issues, but the system offered little beyond official statements. For the families, the conviction brought a measure of closure. Claire said in an interview, "We finally know who, but knowing doesn't erase the years." Marissa's father, his voice thin, added, "It is justice, but justice came late." Delgado attended the trial, sitting in the back. He watched the rope fibers displayed, the DNA charts illuminated. He saw the board from his garage come to life in court. each string of his obsession now connected to a name. When the gavel fell, he closed his eyes. His career had ended in bitterness, but this moment gave him the smallest measure of peace. The trial became a landmark in forensic history. Newspapers called it the first major cold case solved through forensic genealogy in Washington. Law enforcement hailed it as a revolution. Conferences displayed Ethan and Marissa's case as a model for the future. Their tragedy became the foundation for change, their silence the reason other families would one day receive answers. Still, in the hallways outside court, silence lingered. Families embraced, but their eyes betrayed exhaustion. Closure was not the same as healing. Years had been stolen, trust in institutions had been broken. What remained was a conviction and a sentence, but no restoration. When the trial ended, evidence was boxed again. The rope fibers, cigarette butts, hair samples, and Ethan's journal were sealed into archival containers. Some were displayed during public lectures. Others were stored in vaults. Each item had traveled decades, through neglect and mishandling, until science resurrected them as voices of the dead. The last image of the trial was the evidence board wheeled from the courtroom, photographs of Ethan and Marissa still pinned beside DNA charts. The judge's gavel echoed once more, fading into silence. The conviction closed the courtroom chapter, but the story did not end with a gavel. For 30 years, the case had lived in families, in towns, in binders, in whispered theories. Justice arrived, but it carried the taste of rust, late, metallic, unfinished. Claire Ward returned home with Ethan's journal in her arms. She placed it inside a glass display case, not in a museum but in her living room where visitors could see the final circled words. Trust broken too late. She began speaking publicly, traveling to universities and police conferences. She told audiences that evidence preservation mattered more than speed, that negligence cost decades, that families lived entire lifetimes in suspension. She became both advocate and archivist, carrying her brother's memory into lecture halls. Marissa's parents aged into frailty. Her father, who once thundered at vigils, spoke less now, his voice soft and halting. He admitted in one interview, "I spent more years without her than with her." His words lingered, raw, the mathematics of absence more brutal than any sentence handed to the killer. Her mother rarely appeared in public again. She declined interviews, declining anniversaries, carrying her grief privately. The community fractured in quieter ways. Annual vigils grew smaller, candles still lit but fewer each year. The murder house in Snohomish decayed fully, its roof caving, its basement consumed by rot. Teenagers stopped daring each other to enter. The myth no longer felt alive once the killer had a name. Yet the geography retained its weight. Every ferry still seemed haunted. Every truck stop still carried unease. The corridor itself became a kind of memorial. Law enforcement praised the case as a triumph of forensic genealogy. Press releases spoke of revolution, of science finally triumphing over silence. Yet beneath celebration lay unease. Privacy advocates warned that the same tools that solved Ethan and Marissa's murders could also build surveillance networks without oversight. Conferences debated ethics but rarely addressed the deeper wound, that the system had failed for decades before technology arrived to rescue it. Delgado retired without ceremony. He dismantled his garage board, removing the sagging red string, filing photographs into boxes. He kept only one item pinned to the wall, a photocopy of the rope fibers. When asked why, he replied, "Because that rope spoke before anyone else would." For him, the conviction did not erase the memory of memos ignored, evidence misplaced, warnings buried. Justice had come, but not through diligence, through luck and time. The objects of the case became artifacts. The journal, the rope fibers, the cigarette butts, the soil samples, all displayed in a museum exhibit titled "Cold Cases Resolved." Visitors stared through glass at ordinary things transformed by violence. Children pressed faces to the cases, reading captions, while parents explained words like DNA and chain of custody. The victims' lives were reduced to evidence tags and laminated panels, but in those objects their presence endured. Yet evil never ended with one man. Investigators reviewing the corridor still found unsolved murders echoing the same methods: rope, cigarettes, abandoned cars. Walter Halden Roman II was convicted, but whether he was the only predator remained unanswered. The network theory persisted unresolved, a whisper that the case was both solved and unsolved at once. For the families, aftermath meant adapting to silence. No more courtrooms, no more vigils demanding answers. Just graves tended quietly, photographs framed in fading color, journals placed on shelves. Survival became the act of carrying memory forward. In time, the case left headlines, replaced by new tragedies. But in the archives of forensic science, Ethan and Marissa remained a turning point. The moment DNA spoke louder than bureaucracy. Their deaths rewrote investigative practice, reshaped policy, and forced institutions to acknowledge both their failure and their capacity for renewal. Late one evening, Claire visited the museum where Ethan's journal was displayed. She stood alone, staring at the glass, watching the words under sterile light. Visitors passed without notice. She whispered once softly, "I kept my promise." Then she walked away, leaving the journal behind. The last page of the journal rested under glass, ink fading into silence.